Let's talk about Haunted, a song that supposes, what if The Haunting of Hill House were a romantic comedy? First, I figured I'd discuss the plot, the story, the themes, the lyrics, the songwriting aspect of it. But before I get into that, if you've heard the song already, or if you feel like going through the high school English class experience of poetry analysis and want to just pause the video and briefly read through the lyrics in the description, I would love to hear from you what you think all this is about before I explain what I intended it to be about. Because I figure there's going to be a difference. I just don't know how large. So this is the last song that I wrote, or at least that I started writing for this concept album of which it is a part. High level, the concept here is Faywave, which admittedly is kind of me trying to make fetch happen, but the intent is to take synthwave as a foundation with the sort of retro analog synths as the baseline sound, but more modern production values and songwriting style, and fuse that with Irish traditional music elements. But then thematically, texturally, lyrically, everything fits into the Fae realm. Fairies, fairy tales, the unseen world. I mean it fairly expansively, and I will do a separate video explaining what the Fae, fairies mean to me in this context. But fundamentally, they represent the human need for narrative, for stories that explain the world beyond our senses and beyond our comprehension. And though I stray from it a bit, particularly in this song actually, the center of gravity is in fairy tales, fairy stories, things that come particularly from Irish fairy literature, branching into the other Celtic worlds, and just fantasy in general, then leading into what fantasy has become over the past 100+ years. So with that setting, sat down with a blank canvas one day a few months ago and thought I wanted to write something in specifically the synthwave vein as opposed to more ambient or anything else. I'll get into the particulars of that later, talking about the individual synths used. But pretty soon I had sections that were growing into a song that sounded like probably a verse and a chorus. And at this stage, I'm often uncertain of whether this is going to be an instrumental or a song with vocals. And the way that I discovered that, I treat it as something that sort of wants to happen. I know there are absolutely musicians who can say, I am going to write this kind of song, and they sit down and they do that. That is not how I treat music. I play and let things happen organically and kind of grow into what they want to be. I will try and get into a sort of liminal headspace. It's essentially brainstorming. I try and turn off the critical part of my brain and just loop part of the song. And so this is basically the stage I was at. This is what I had and that I was brainstorming against. There were some whispers in there, but those weren't there at the time. Essentially, that was on a loop, and I just kind of turn on the mic, record, put the headphones on, and mumble, sing, whatever comes out. And this, I think, is the first thing I kept record to, implies that this is like literally the second loop. This is what I came up with. As I lay here, listen to the rain falling down. Right, so that was the starting point, and that pretty quickly grew into what turned into the first verse, even though you can see here in this layout, the verses started at measure 19 here, and I had this setup is probably the second verse at some point.
As I lay here, watching the patterns of the shadows of rain.
So I had a little bit of a start of basically what turned into the beginning of the song, but I didn't have any overarching story in mind. I didn't know where it was going. Meanwhile, over the preceding months, I think, the actual plot of the song as it ended up had been forming in my mind as something that I wanted to do, which is a haunted house that falls in love with its occupant, who then leaves, and then we have a lost love song from the perspective of the haunted house. So if you had that on your bingo card, then good job. You figured me out. So when I started this off with the joke about The Haunting of Hill House, that really was truly, I think, very close to where my brain went. Not romantic comedy, but like treating that as a kind of a serious love story and the haunted house not being malevolent. Instead, in my imagining of this, the entity that is the house is an ancient being, a fae being who was bound to this place ages, thousands of years ago, for who knows what crime, and who knows who did the binding. It's been so long that the entity itself has forgotten who it was or what it did before this. But eventually, this house is built upon it, and it is thusly haunted. And most people who interact with this haunted house experience it as a haunted house in the typical horror genre way. But there is this Lydia Deetz type of character who just sort of belongs there. This is right for them. But it doesn't last. Eventually it gets to them, or they move on with their life for completely unrelated reasons. And the entity, the house, doesn't know what that means or how to handle that. Now this plot, this theme was fully formed in my mind at this point, but I expected when I got around to writing that song that it would be something darker, slower, moodier, like some of the other tracks on the album. I certainly did not intend it to have this upbeat pop sound with the major chorus.
So come inside.
But I don't know how much it was a natural fit versus how much it was just what was on my mind, but I couldn't help considering the possibility that these two songs were the same song. And I let the lyrics that I was essentially brainstorming start moving in that direction, and I liked everything that happened. And so while it wasn't intentional, I really ended up loving the juxtaposition between the mood of the sound of the song, the vibe of the song, versus what it's actually about and what it means. I think it sort of emphasizes the detachedness of the speaker, of the protagonist of this entity, from normalcy as we mere humans experience it. And I want to come back to the Haunting of Hill House thing, and specifically I do mean the Mike Flanagan show, because I am not generally much of a horror fan as a genre as a whole, largely because nihilism is such a ubiquitous part of that genre, and I don't really like that. My brain can manufacture plenty of nihilism on its own over the course of just existing in the world. I don't need more. But that adaptation of The Haunting of Hill House, and I confess I have not read the book, I don't know if this is present there or if this is the addition of Mike Flanagan, but it does not feel nihilistic at all. It feels set in a cruel and perilous world, but the arcs of the characters have so much pathos and compassion and emphasis on sympathy and empathy, and connection, I suppose. I really can't say anything about the show that does it justice. It's just phenomenal. And certainly it's part of a genre trope, the haunted house in general, but also the notion that the house itself might have intent or consciousness. But typically, I think because haunted houses are by default part of the horror genre, and because so much of horror is leaving things unexplained and unknown, you rarely get an explanation for why is the house, why is the haunting, at least not one that really digs deep into the past. And so it interested me to explore how that might have come to be and how that connects into essentially stories that largely fall into the realm of the Fae, these supernatural beings who, according to some folklorists, you go back and they're really the Tua de Danann, the mythological gods of ancient Ireland, modified over time to fit into what was palatable to the powers of the day, potentially diminished by the church to be a small thing in the background rather than a truly a competing religion or theology. I'm just going to look through the lyrics again really quickly, make sure there's nothing make sure I'm not forgetting something that I really wanted to mention. No, okay. I didn't forget anything, but this is a clear segue into what I wanted to talk about next, which is the sound effects or the one-shot non-musical instrument components of the song, which originated with this second verse, can't you hear me knocking while you're walking away? So the intent here is the first verse does not hint that this is anything other than a typical human protagonist sharing their thoughts, telling their story. But then knocking while you're walking away could be interpreted as something a person would do, but it's kind of a weird, very specific, peculiar circumstance. Are you knocking at your ex's door and you can tell they're walking away not answering? And so this is intended to hint at the nature of who's telling the story, of from whose perspective this story is being told. But because we're doing that, and because I already have this paradoxical combination of kind of the dark and spooky story that I'm trying to tell with this bright and upbeat music, I wanted additional elements to support what the story actually was. And honestly, this is probably also, at a subconscious level, heavily influenced by Haunting of Hill House. And anyone who is familiar with the show, and when I mention knocking, you might have the same Pavlovian response I am, where I can feel my blood pressure spiking. And so I initially intended this to be more the sound of like a screen door slamming or shutters in the wind, sort of before a storm. I think that's a trope that maybe that goes back to Wizard of Oz. I don't recall exactly when the tornado was coming, but it's certainly a trope I have from films and television, where you have this banging from the house out of control. And if there's no wind and this banging is happening, it definitely has this haunted vibe to it. And so I thought to include a sound evocative of that would reinforce this hint that this isn't a human being telling their story. And so my original intent was more of a gentle sound. But when I went to free sound, as I typically do when I want to include some like one-shot effects of things that are not musical instruments. And if you are unfamiliar, free sound is this incredible site where people put their field recordings of all types of sounds out there for not necessarily public domain use, because some people can do that, but they can license them in various ways according to the Creative Commons licenses. Meaning, usually if it's not public domain, anyone can use this as long as they credit the author. So when I publish this song, I will be publishing a list of the free sound contributors whose sounds I used. Just look here. You can see this is when I was adding these effects, the May 30th and 28th. These are all the effects I downloaded. I didn't necessarily use all of them in the song, though I used quite a few. Any more here? Yeah. Grabbed a bunch of door knocks and such. But once I actually pulled some effects into, let me expand here. This is the effects section, which effects certainly also means, like putting EQs and reverbs on things. But in this context, I put a folder out here for effects, and that's how I conceptualize this part of my project files. Here we are in verse 2, the one with the knocking reference. And once I started putting these things in, I found the sort of screen door slamming or shutters banging to be too subtle to break through what's really a pretty busy mix. And so I started trending toward like loud knocking at a door, which is, sort of an unsettling experience, especially if you're not expecting it, and especially if it is loud and forceful. And here, anyone who is familiar with Haunting of Hill House can see where I subconsciously probably was very much referencing some scenes from that show. And so that's how I ended up with something like this.
Me knocking while you're walking away.
But at the same time, I discovered, as I was trying to organize the original lighter knocking sounds into the song, I found out that they really kind of worked nicely as supplemental percussion. So I ended up making a separate loop that then plays from here through what I call the middle 8 over here. And so that's really just essentially a part of the percussion. And I tried putting that in through the rest of the song as well, but it became kind of distracting and busy because there are other elements that come in and out. Then when the song was essentially done, I was listening to the whole thing and felt that the intro, it starts off, with an instrumental version of the chorus, so that very positive energy pop sound. Now, I had already decided that I specifically liked the juxtaposition of the story with the lighter vibe of the song, but I felt it was just too disjointed to start purely in this one place without the story kicking in at all yet. So I decided to add essentially a audio prologue to the story. This is supposed to be the house remembering this inhabitant it's fallen in love with first arriving. So the sound of unlocking a lock that's been locked for a while in this dusty, foreboding place. The sound of a chain faintly in the background falling to imply it's been locked up. And the steps on echoey hardwood floors that kind of evoke the tropes that I think most of us are familiar with about the haunted house genre. I definitely had a moment of doubt, thinking, isn't it sort of a gimmick to do this kind of thing? And then I remembered that The Cure's Disintegration is just one of the absolute best albums ever, and it's full of sound effects because they serve the song that they're in. And I'm going to do whatever I think serves the song. And I thought this did.
Can't you see the light in my window? It's calling.